Welcome to the Books and Music Show, the Books and Music Review Show. And today we have Gerard, and we're going to be talking about the topic of immigration. So remember that we air on Saturdays, usually at 12:30 in the daytime, on Channel 34, Verizon, and Time Warner Spectrum, or what's soon to be called. I think Time Warner got a new name because they just merged. Okay, welcome, Gerard. Let's hear what you have to say.
Oh, well, thank you for that great introduction. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about a very seemingly contentious subject, namely immigration and illegal immigration, and how we deal with the residue of a very porous southern border and the inability of prior administrations and prior Congresses to forcefully implement immigration policies that are already on the books and border control that has not been sufficiently funded and implemented. Of course, one of the problems is that whenever there's a story about immigration on the news, any news network, uh, it's inevitably some sort of human interest story designed to elicit sympathy for people who are in this country illegally. We never hear about the crimes committed by illegal aliens or the enormous cost and burden placed upon American taxpayers for the upkeep of these systems that allow illegal aliens, more than 500,000 in New York City alone, and somewhere between 12 million and 20 million in the United States. It's such a large number that no one can accurately estimate, even to the closest million, how many people are in this country illegally. Although there are ways of determining based upon things like individual taxpayer identification numbers, which are usually used by illegal aliens to pay taxes on their earnings, and sometimes to even receive refunds from the government, tax refunds. But there, the landscape is such, and the media has such a stranglehold on the discussion, even with the advent of the internet, that almost every story is a discussion of how to make the lives of illegal aliens better, um, how to fast track citizenship for them, how to pay for their college. In New Jersey, the governor just signed into law a bill that would essentially uh, essentially force New Jersey taxpayers to give illegal aliens a free ride through college. It would allow them to apply for scholarships and to be given taxpayer money for their tuition, um, and enjoy other benefits that were only eligible that only New Jersey American citizens were eligible for. And this is a particularly um, resonant issue for me because I remember I have a friend who came here from Israel, who came to New York from Israel, and he was forced to pay an enormous amount in out of state tuition, even though he lived in New York City for years, and he was here legally on a green card before he became a U.S. citizen, and yet he was still forced to pay out of state tuition because he wasn't a citizen, despite the fact that he had lived in New York. So things like that, like paying, defraying the costs of tuition for people whose only contribution has been to willfully violate the American laws. Not every person who came here illegally was brought here when they were 3 or 4 or 5 years old. And this is the dominant media narrative that they want to impose upon this debate. It's why you never hear stories like, you never hear stories of illegal aliens that accidentally killed someone in an auto accident, illegal criminal aliens who were driving illegally. And if you do hear stories, they're quickly buried. You never hear week-long exposés of what illegal immigrants are doing that's negative. It does, and there are very few nationwide stories like the Kate Steinle shooting, where an illegal alien who had entered the country multiple times, who had crossed the border illegally and had multiple felonies, shot Kate Steinle to death and was given essentially a slap on the wrist, not even 18 months for what amounted to manslaughter. And the media sees nothing wrong with that. They want to focus on artificially created narratives like the current topic du jour, the Trump administration ostensibly separating young illegal alien unaccompanied minors from their parents. Now, even the peg on which this story hinges is completely erroneous. There's, excuse me, the Trump administration had nothing to do with this policy. But in order to understand how it's being misrepresented, you have to go back at least 2.5 decades or 2 decades to 1997, when there was a Supreme Court decision called the Flores decision. And what that was, it was brought by advocates of illegal aliens. And what it did was force the government to accommodate illegal alien families in the least restrictive detention facilities, at least the children of illegal alien families, in the least restrictive environment. Now, this was relitigated in 2011 and afterwards, when thousands of illegal migrants from Central America made their way to the Mexican-American border and crossed the border illegally and were subsequently detained by the U.S. Border Patrol. Now, when they were being housed in overcrowded facilities that weren't designed to hold tens of thousands or even thousands of illegal aliens, again, there were pro-illegal alien advocacy groups that forced them to or at least attempted to force them to release these illegal aliens. They were ultimately unsuccessful, but essentially what was happening was a sort of flood the system gambit, where they thought, if we just pour across the border by the tens of thousands, then it'll be a fait accompli. And you have to remember the context in which this occurred. Namely, the Obama administration had been pursuing stealth administrative amnesty for the past, essentially between 2011, the year before his re-election campaign, and the end of his tenure in the White House. So you had the Morton memo which was an administrative amnesty, although albeit less broad than subsequent amnesties. You had deferred action for childhood arrivals, which was a plan to grant a mini amnesty to approximately 800,000 children, illegal alien children. These were people that were purportedly brought here as little kids. Now, even here, you have to kind of parse the media generated spin, because these kids, in order to apply for DACA, you could be up to the age of 16 and under, I believe it was some 35 or 32. So essentially, you had young adults and some grown adults who were able to apply under DACA, a program purportedly geared towards illegal alien children, who were the most sympathetic subgroup among the 12 to 15 million illegal aliens in the United States. So they were used as a sort of stalking horse for a broader amnesty, which is why you had the DREAM Act, why it's been so fiercely debated. The DREAM Act was introduced in 2001, over nearly 2 decades ago, and it's been repeatedly rejected by Congress, despite the fact that most congressmen favor amnesty in a broad sense, but they faced resistance from an outraged American public and grassroots political action that forced them to ultimately back down every time that the DREAM Act was on the verge of being enacted, even when the Democrats had total control of Congress. So you had a DACA, which was a kind of downsized version of the DREAM Act. And after that, you had DAPA, which was even broader and less constitutionally viable. It applied to adults of these children. So what you had was a series of administrative actions that covered virtually half, somewhere on the order of 5 to 6 million illegal aliens that were part of the broader 12 million illegal aliens in the U.S., which Congress and various administrations have been trying to amnesty for the past 2 decades. Excuse me. And this was the context under which the flood of unaccompanied minors from Central America, from countries like primarily Honduras and El Salvador, came into the United States and pressed this issue and created the legal and political problem that we see the media manipulating today in order to impose their political vision onto a reluctant public, because the public in general is opposed to amnesty. They don't want to grant legalization and naturalization and citizenship to the 12 to 20 million. We don't even know how many people are here illegally. The chances are that it's the number is much larger than the one being bandied about by open borders advocates and amnesty advocates. And the public doesn't want to amnesty those people, but if you can create a narrative which focuses on intensely emotional issues, things like pictures of children in cages, even though the pictures come from even though the pictures were taken during the Obama administration, and some of the pictures aren't even accurate. One was a protest against immigration laws where the protesters brought fake cages as a sort of political agitprop, and an illegal alien journalist from the Philippines, Juan Jose Antonio Vargas, who's still in the country despite repeatedly defying the law. He took that picture of a protest and tried to and tweeted it out, trying to give his followers the mistaken assumption that the Trump administration was throwing children into cages. It's gotten so incredibly absurd that you have journalists in the White House press briefing room hectoring the Trump administration's hectoring the White House press secretary for defending the laws of the United States. And I think that's the main problem with this debate. This idea that these people only oppose separating children from their parents it's just a specious notion. It's a complete canard, and it's a canard for a number of reasons. One of them being the fact that over somewhere on the order of 100,000 children are separated from their parents every year by Child Protective Services. Now, in some of those instances, these people come from abusive homes, and they're being separated from parents who are physically abusing them. But in a lot of cases, they're not. We don't know the circumstances of all of these cases, and yet there's never been an outcry against this by the same people who want you to believe that the Trump administration is a totalitarian, fascist regime, because it won't allow people who came into the country illegally to be with their children. Now, another reason that this is a kind of a red herring is because none of these people support illegal aliens being detained. If there were family detention centers, which were being built during the Obama administration to accommodate these people, if there were family detention centers and these people were not separated, they would not stop protesting. They're against the idea of holding illegal aliens, detaining them, and ultimately deporting them. It's not the separation of child from parent that it's not the separation of child from parent they oppose. It's the whole concept, the whole framework of securing the American border, and there even being a border that separates us from Mexico and Central American countries. So, I mean, you even have to look at the basic idea of families and kids. We have no way of verifying that the people bringing these children across the border are their parents. Why would we release children to parents whose relationship we can't identify? The same people who are criticizing this policy were the ones claiming that the Department of Homeland Security was callous for releasing children to people whom they couldn't track and who might be human traffickers. How do we know that these parents aren't human traffickers themselves? There's no real way to identify them as their parents. And furthermore, it's just the height of hypocrisy to claim that you care solely about children being with their parents when the only time you raise this issue is in the context of illegal aliens defying our laws, not in any other social or criminal context where children are routinely separated from their parents. And a good example of how specious these arguments are is is an article by Ilya Somin, a Russian immigrant who wrote a piece for Reason claiming that this was not legally or morally justifiable. Now, this is the same Ilya Somin that wrote a piece prior to this claiming that legal immigrants, legal permanent residents, should have the exact same rights as American citizens. In other words, they should never be deported, regardless of the fact that they might have committed crimes that would lead them to be stripped of their citizenship status. I think that's the main point that I'd like to emphasize. The people who are protesting these detentions do not want U.S. borders, because, after all, when you think of this, how do you deter future illegal immigration if you accept the premise that you're not going to be punished as long as you bring a kid with you along the border? Now, these parents brought their children hundreds and hundreds of miles across countries, large swaths of which are controlled by drug cartels. How is that less? How is that showing parental concern? And why do you expect the federal government to be more concerned about about these children than their own parents? Not that there's been any evidence that the detention facilities they're in are these horrible dystopian nightmares, which have been compared to the Japanese internment camps or Nazi concentration camps. It just goes to show you the hyperbole and just ridiculously incoherent arguments being used by open borders advocates in order to defend an essentially indefensible position, namely that there should be no borders between the United States and its southern neighbors. Now, they've also kind of conflated a few different issues. The idea of people applying for political asylum and ordinary economic migrants who come into the country illegally. Now, you're allowed, technically you're allowed to apply for political asylum if you at the United States border. But the thing is, these are people who came from countries that are incredibly violent. For example, Honduras and El Salvador, nations controlled, large swaths of which are controlled by gangs like MS-13, the brutal Central American gang that has committed so many real atrocities on American soil, and which open borders advocates condemned Donald Trump for comparing excuse me, condemned Donald Trump. They condemned Donald Trump for comparing them to animals, despite the fact that they've dismembered their victims and have routinely committed horrific atrocities against both immigrants and American citizens. Now, the people that came from those countries claim that they're eligible for political asylum, but the fact is they're not. Being in a violent country is not a basis for political asylum unless the violence being directed against you is based upon your religion or your political philosophy. Furthermore, they could claim asylum in Mexico. What they're doing is essentially going through a third country and claiming political asylum in the U.S. because they have a better life in the U.S., which I don't blame them for wanting to live in the U.S. rather than Honduras or El Salvador, but I don't think it's a logically consistent argument to say you're fleeing political violence and you want asylum, and yet you don't apply for asylum in Mexico, where when the truth is Mexico, except for the 5 northern states, is no more violent than the United States. They don't have to live in Ciudad Juarez or or even or even Acapulco, or any of the the parts of Mexico that are ravaged by cartels. They could live in Mexico City, or a less violent part of Mexico, but they don't want to because Mexico is not as prosperous as the United States. So that's one issue that has kind of been introduced into this debate in a misleading way, that there are tons of people who are legitimate political refugees when there really aren't. And this issue is too complex to go over all of the intricacies in less than a half hour, of course. But I'm just trying to explain give you some of the broad brushstrokes of what's actually happening, which is something that you're not going to get from the mainstream media, which is intent on imposing their view onto a resistant public, to the point where they're releasing polls by Quinnipiac showing how much the American public despises separating families, even though they're not explaining what exactly that means. So you have journalists, you have polling companies enlisted in this effort, you have open borders advocacy groups and vologs, and even religious groups, the Roman Catholic Church and the Methodist Church. And people forget these churches. They also have vologs, which are voluntary refugee resettlement agencies. They make millions of dollars every year by virtue of the fact that we have a broken immigration system with hundreds of thousands of immigrants and refugees who need to be subsistent on the government, and they have they have a lifeline, in a sense, in the American taxpayer, which is why they're condemning the Donald Trump's immigration policies. It's not simply, although some of it may be motivated by their reading of scripture, some of it may in fact be motivated by monetary gain. And none of these issues are being brought up by the news media. They're just unwilling to even entertain the argument, entertain a dissenting view, which is why you never see people like Mark Krikorian or people from the Center for Immigration Studies being interviewed, or if they are, they're given a few minutes to explain why open borders policies are bad. So I thought I would just give you a taste of what's actually going on, and why the false narrative propounded by the media is so damaging, not only to public discourse, but to any sort of eventual long-term solution to our immigration problem. And I hope I elucidated these issues just a little bit for people who might not be as familiar with it. And I hope you all, everyone watching this, does some of their own research and learns a little bit more about this subject beyond the headlines and some of the just what you read in Newsweek or what you see on ABC News, and kind of gets an idea that this is a little bit more complex than just the simple talking points you've seen regurgitated on the network news or you've read in the newspaper. So that's about it for this topic. Hopefully we will be able to talk more on future episodes, and I hope you watch Books and Music Review this Saturday and on future Saturdays. Enjoy.